Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this latest Conservative Voice event, which is a US election special. My name's Alex LeVay. I'm one of the Conservative Voice core team members, and absolutely thrilled today to be joined by Andy Bookless, who's a great friend, not only of mine, but of Conservative Voice as well. Andy, just by way of introduction, is a real election and marketing campaign specialist. He has run numerous political campaigns, numerous private sector campaigns, delivering not only electoral success, but millions of pounds and dollars of growth for commercial entities as well. Currently based in Philadelphia in the States, Andy is the founder and CEO of A2P, which is a marketing technology firm specializing in engagement and campaigns. He's a man with a real finger on the pulse of all things US politics, and delighted to be joined by him today. So Andy, thank you very much. It's great that we can share our conversation with the Conservative Voice followership. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. I'm looking forward to this, and especially looking forward to the fact that it's going to be recorded, so that all of my predictions are stuck in recorded evidence for the future. But no, this will be good. I'm looking forward to it.
We'd have it no other way. And kicking off in that vein, I suppose it would be great to hear your take on what the polls are doing at the moment, what the key trends have been. How do you see things panning out in the presidential race?
Yeah, I mean, Biden has been ahead for as long as we've been watching the polls in the presidential campaign. I tend to spend a good amount of time every day on the Real Clear Politics website. That's probably, in my mind, one of the better kind of tracking polls. They take averages of all the different polls that are out there. So for anyone in the Conservative Voice audience that kind of are looking for good indicators, I would say that Real Clear Politics is a good place to start. You know, it's important to remember with US presidential elections that the popular vote doesn't really make that much of a difference. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. The Democrats tend to win the popular vote, mainly because of California. So it all comes down to a number of battleground states. Those battleground states, probably for the last 3 or 4 presidential cycles, have been the same. This is going to be a different election for many reasons, I'm sure, that we'll get into today, Alex, but the number of potential battleground states is widening. So just as an example, you know, I live in Pennsylvania. That is a battleground state and has been a battleground state for a number of years. But Arizona, where A2P does quite a bit of work, has been a pretty traditionally conservative, solid red state in the last 20 years. This year, it's a tie at the moment. Everything's with it up to play for. Trump, I believe, has been down there 3 or 4 times in the last 2 weeks. Kamala Harris has been sent down there. A lot of Biden surrogates have been sent down there. People are even talking about Texas being a toss-up. Now, I'm not convinced that the Democrats are necessarily going to win Texas, but they could win in Arizona. There are a lot of new voters that are coming to the polls for the first time. The Democrats have done an exceptionally good job in the last few years of registering new voters. A lot of Latino voters have joined the electoral roll for the first time in the last few years. And younger voters are more motivated than I've ever seen in US or UK politics. Just the amount of conversations happening on college campuses is exceptional. So the polls have had Biden winning for a long time. They had him double digits winning, and some polls still do have him winning by double digits overall. But I think you have to look at some of the key battleground states. And I do have Real Clear Politics up right here because it's always running in my on my computer like a ticker along the bottom of my screen. So nationally, Biden's got a 7.8% lead. But when you break that down into the key battleground states, I look at Pennsylvania. Biden is currently got a 3.6% lead across the last 7 or 8 polls. I mean, with a margin of error of 3, that's essentially a toss-up, right? When I look at Wisconsin, that Trump won surprisingly in 2016, they have Biden up 6 points right now. I've heard recently that because Wisconsin is one of the states that's getting some of the most aggressive coronavirus infections and hospitalizations, that actually Biden is increasing his lead there. and we'll talk a little bit about issues later, I believe, but essentially if the election is about coronavirus and healthcare, Biden wins. If it's about the economy, Trump can win. So those are kind of the two key areas. But like we always talk about in electoral math, you have to hit a certain number of electoral college votes, and the heavier, densely populated a state is, the more electoral college votes it has. Florida has always been a bellwether. Biden was up 8 points after the first debate, which again, we'll talk about the first debate in a little bit, because I know it got a lot of media coverage. It's now down to 1.2. It's essentially a toss-up again. So we knew the polls were going to tighten. In key states, they're tightening even more. I think Florida will likely still be the swing state that's most important, but Biden has a lot more opportunities to get to his electoral number than Trump does. And Trump isn't currently winning some of the states he won in 2016, which got him his pathway to the White House. So, it's Biden's to lose. It's Trump's to pull off another shocker, and it will likely come down to somewhere between Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Florida, I think, on election day.
And given we're sort of a week out now, how does Trump's position in the polls now compare to this sort of time frame out in the 2016 election? Because as you said, he took so many of those states by complete surprise. People thought that Hillary Clinton was on for, a landslide victory, and Wisconsin and others went Trump. They went red. So is that going to happen again, or are the calculations so different this time around that it would be unlikely?
Yeah, I think you have to give credit to the pollsters for learning from their mistakes, right? I think the pollsters didn't necessarily call Brexit. They didn't necessarily call Trump in 2016. I think at least from the pollsters that I've been talking to recently, a lot of them have recognized that their methodologies and some of their models were missing a section of the voter demographic, those kind of non-traditional voters. And they've rebuilt their models to compensate for that. So my sense is that the polls are more accurate now than they were in 2016. You hear a lot of people on the Trump campaign saying that Trump voters don't answer polls, and that's probably true to a degree. Young people don't answer polls as well, right? To a large degree, because a lot of young people don't have telephone lines, so pollsters can't call them on the phone and ask them questions. But good pollsters have a mix of digital and telephone polling methodologies, plus they go out into the field and physically do focus groups. And one of those is Frank Luntz over here. He's a very famous pollster and does a lot of dial testing. There's a couple of good podcasts out there right now with Frank kind of talking through the last couple of debates and what impact they might have had on decision making. And without exception, I think they're pretty grim reading for the Trump campaign at the moment. So compared to 2016, Trump is behind by more now than he was in 2016, I believe. That may not be the same in every state, but just generally. And then just in terms of interpretations, we were talking about this earlier. Trump was very effective in 2016 because despite being a reality TV star, a lot of people didn't really know who he was, what he was about, what he could be relied on to do, what he might not be relied on to do. It's kind of like Leicester winning the Premier League, right? They took the Premier League by surprise, and then the year afterwards, they almost got relegated. I think they were mid-table, right, at best, and Chelsea ended up coming back and winning. So to follow that analogy, both the pollsters and the Democratic Party, and maybe some of the media have recognized that 4 years of seeing Donald Trump every day and listening to him every day on Twitter maybe has had an impact on voters in 2020 that they didn't have in 2016.
And Andy, it's been such a heated campaign from everything that we've seen here in the UK, so many issues. I mean, what would you say are the big defining issues of this campaign? What are the big talking points over in the States? What's been really driving people's attention around the campaign this time?
I mean, it all depends on either the day of the week that it is, or maybe more importantly, where you get your news from, right? I think a lot of the developments in the last couple of presidential cycles, for me at least, watching it pretty close up, have been how polarized the media has become. You know, if you just get your news from Fox News, then you're going to have one interpretation of the world. If you get your news from MSNBC or CNN, you're going to get, on the exact same issue with the exact same facts and statistics, you're probably going to get a different outcome and interpretation. Similarly, on social media, I think that's driving a lot more of the what people get their news from, quote unquote news. You know, they're sharing it, but they're also putting their spin on it and their interpretation on it. So, I mean, again, there are vastly different opinions on what's driving the election. I think they probably fall into 4 or 5 buckets. I mean, this is going to be the coronavirus election purely because we're living through it whilst the election's happening. And there are so many consequences of that on how the election is going to pan out, you know, for no other reason than early voting is huge this year, right? There's been more votes cast early already 4 days before the election in some states than actually voted in the entirety of 2016. Right. So I believe maybe Texas has had more early votes sent in via mail already than they had cast in the whole of 2016's outcome. So if, as we said, if coronavirus becomes the defining issue, which in a lot of polls it is, and the Biden campaign have you know, bet their campaign on it. If voters, particularly independent voters, particularly kind of moderate Republicans and moderate Democrat voters, and particularly those voters in suburban areas, right? So not inner city areas and not the rural areas. Those pretty much, if you live in an urban area, you know, for the most part, you're going to vote Democrat. If you live in a rural area, for the most part, you're going to vote Republican. That's a gross injustice on all the people who are in those areas, but that tends to be how the electoral math plays out. But the suburbs are, in many states, Georgia, which is now a swing state, which we never thought it would be, here in Pennsylvania, Arizona, you know, the Phoenix metro area. If you're a suburban voter in those areas and the infection rate goes up and hospitalization rates go up around the time that early voting has been happening, then, you know, coronavirus becomes the defining issue of the election. And whether or not it's how did President Trump and his administration handle it, which is what the Biden team want you to think, or whether it's more about personal and civil liberties and freedoms, and, you know, should you be forced to wear a mask, which is how the Republicans and the Trump campaign have necessarily been pushing it, and the economic impact of coronavirus. I think that's likely how they're positioning the same issue, right? Like we talked about, you know, 2 sides of a single issue. The economy, which traditionally is the #1 issue for most people and is still very important, particularly to people that have lost their jobs and haven't had their jobs come back. So people in the entertainment industry, retail industry, leisure industry, travel industry, you know, that's going to have an impact on people. I think the GDP numbers that came out yesterday, which the Trump campaign rightly touted as just astonishingly good, also were released when about 70 million people had already cast an early vote. So essentially, you know, the same number of people that live in the UK have already cast an early vote. And then the news came out that the economy had bounced back in the 3rd quarter. For 70 million people, that news didn't make a difference to how they were going to vote. You know, earlier in the summer, here in Philadelphia and other big cities, there were lots of protests. Some of those protests became violent protests. The Black Lives Matter movement was on a lot of front pages of newspapers. It was on a lot of TV news coverages, with the exception of a couple of localized incidents. And we actually had one a few days ago in Philadelphia where a police officer killed someone in the line of duty, and that triggered some new protests and some new looting and violent activity. For the most part, that has become less of a headline issue. I think it's still important to a lot of voters, although I think a lot of those voters had already planned and were already planning to vote Democrat and likely against Donald Trump. There are some exceptions to that, and they're really interesting ones. And, you know, we can nerd out a little bit here on kind of coalitions of voters and who Trump could win and who Biden could win. Remember, Trump won the kind of the white male unionized workers to a large degree in 2016 that helped him win in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin. he's still likely to win some of those demographics, but probably by a lower proportion this time out. He will lose Latino voters, but he actually loses Latino male voters by significantly less than Latino female voters. He will likely win about a third of the Latino male vote. And that's stayed pretty steady throughout the last 4 years, I believe. Think about Florida. That could have a direct impact on the election. Black voters, Trump does less well with than Latino voters. I think he won about 6% of that demographic in 2016, but he looks like in some polls he could win 10, 11, 12% of that demographic in 2020. More men again than women. I think Ice Cube has come out and endorsed President Trump, and a big part of that is that Trump has listened to some of the celebrities like Kanye and Kim Kardashian about reform of the criminal justice system, and that's real. But in other ways, I think a lot of young Black male voters actually like Trump's strength and positioning, and have come out and said that they actually want, a strong president. And Trump has done a very good job of defining Joe Biden as Sleepy Joe, as maybe a little weaker. I also think there are some risks within the discussion on race and within the Black Lives Matter movement that start to hurt them with Democrat voters as well. So often what I think we saw on television was that where there was looting, where there were riots, it tended to be in predominantly Black neighborhoods where voters actually wanted police presence to protect property and protect businesses and homes. And so the idea of defunding the police didn't actually appeal to a lot of voters in those areas. So there's a whole myriad of things going on just within that very, simple seeming word of race in America and how people are going to vote. So I think COVID is absolutely the number one thing that will shape how a lot of people vote. How that impacts the economy certainly is another part of it. And then I think there are we talked earlier, is this the craziest election ever in America? I mean, it's a crazy election, but think about 2016, even think about 2012 and 2008. There's always something crazy happening in US elections. That's why I love working out here.
Yeah, sure.
I'm watching these elections from the side.
Remind me, how long have you been living in the States now?
I mean, on and off since 2008. So I was fortunate to, the very first campaign I ever worked on was Theresa May's re-election in 2005, because I was a constituent in Maidenhead and wrote a letter to her as a very obtuse 24-year-old saying that I thought her campaign could do with better communications. And to her credit, she wrote back and said, well, thank you for your blunt advice. Maybe you could come and give me some of your thoughts. And I did. And her and Philip have been great friends ever since. And, one of the things that we did on Theresa's campaign was say, look, different voter groups are looking for different things from their elected officials. Let's go and talk to them. And, we would do mini focus groups and things like that. And it was Theresa that connected me with the first member of Congress that I ever came across and volunteered on in the western suburbs of Illinois, a guy called Peter Roscombe. And he was running for election in 2006, which seems like an age ago. And I got the chance to come back 2 years later and help run his re-election campaign in 2008. And then, met my girlfriend on that campaign, who's now my wife. And, those things kind of evolved from there. But no, I've seen a few elections, and this is certainly the one with, let's call it the loudest rhetoric that's been going on. But I mean, US elections are always crazy. Think about 2000 and hanging Chads in Florida and Gore and Bush. There's always something that's going on that we in the UK probably are just blown away by, right?
Yeah. And I suppose, and over that 12-year period, living in the US on and off, is this the most polarized it's been? Do you think American politics is getting more polarized, or is that a misconception? Because I think certainly in the UK, the media and sort of the content we're getting is showing a very polarized America, and almost an America that can't be brought back together, can't be reunified. Is that a fair assumption to make?
I have an optimistic view. Just being an immigrant to the US, and maybe I've drunk the Kool-Aid about it, but I think it's definitely a challenging time, and I definitely don't think that some of the rhetoric helps. But I also, I look at, and the US is, when I talk to friends back home about US elections, this isn't one election. This is 50 states with 10, 20, 30 different elections happening at one time within those states. So it's just this huge amalgamation of elections going on. And, we probably, when I was growing up, my view of America was New York, right? Or it was what we saw in the movies from LA. That's not, in my mind now, that's not America from what I've seen over the last, 10, 15 years. Like, I've been knocking on doors in Wyoming, which is the one of the smaller, most Republican states in the US, and it hugely rural, right? Massively dependent on coal and natural resources. You compare that to New York City or New York State or Vermont or Arizona. I mean, there are so many cultural impacts in the US that the US, and again, I'm no student of history, but the US has always been kind of ebbing and flowing, and there's always strain and tension within the system. Yeah, it's probably more amplified now because of social media and how much time we all spend on social media. And yeah, probably the news networks are amplifying it because it's good for business models and it's good for viewers, and therefore it's good for advertisers. Is it more kind of polarized than it was during the Vietnam era? I mean, that was before yours and my time, but I'm guessing not. Is it more polarized than it was in the years leading up to, it's a horrible analogy to make, but the Civil War? No, I don't think it was. The US has always had those challenges, and it has always overcome them. And I think you look at the fact that this is going to likely be the highest turnout election since, I think someone said 1908 on like one of the TV shows recently. Like, if you're a voter in the US, you're turning up to vote this year, no matter what. So that for me is a hugely optimistic thing about America, right? Because they have a voice, they have a vote. They're all going to choose to use it in whatever way. I may not agree with, some or many of their voices, but I love the fact that they're so invested in it. I love the fact that the Democrats are raising more money than you could ever imagine, and a lot of it's coming from small donors. I love the fact that little old ladies are out knocking on doors for the Republican candidates in the middle of a pandemic. May not be the smartest thing for them to do in the world, but they believe in the system, and they believe in their candidates, and they believe in their party, and they believe in their country, and that's a huge thing. So I'm always optimistic about the US, and maybe that's me being naive, but I also think that Americans are pretty optimistic. Yeah, it's a pretty challenging time for everyone in the States, for everyone in the UK, for everyone in the world right now. But I also think that I'm going to use another football analogy now. What is it? Bounce back ability is a big thing in the States.
You mentioned knocking on doors there, and I suppose there's been far less knocking on doors than in previous elections. And I suppose there was already a growing trend to, more digital campaigning, more use of social media, maybe perhaps particularly given President Trump's use of Twitter, among other platforms. How's that played out this time round? How's the use of digital and digital campaigns, been different, or has moved the dial in a different way than in previous years?
I mean, there's been some big differences within the platforms themselves. I mean, they all came under a lot of scrutiny, obviously, after 2016 and the Russian influence in terms of creating fake accounts and spreading misinformation. So on Facebook, where a lot of my clients spend time and money on Facebook, we're now in the first ever restricted period, which basically means that as of Tuesday, just gone the 27th, you cannot run new Facebook ads. So you have to submit your Facebook ad to Facebook. They review it. Now, you can argue whether or not Facebook should be reviewing content that politicians want to get out to people, but it's their platform at the end of the day. So we abide by their rules. So a lot of campaigns had to react quickly, and essentially for a lot of firms like mine, election day was the 27th, because we had to get all of our clients' messages, all of our get out the vote information pre-approved by Facebook and set up ready to go on the 27th, so that in that 7-day period, when the only thing you can really change on it within Facebook at this point are budgets, because at the end of the day, Facebook still wants advertising dollars to come in through its platform. So that's a big deal, and that's had an impact on campaigns. And if you didn't get your ad submitted by midday on Tuesday, you ain't getting your message out on Facebook. And Facebook's important because it's just so big of a platform and so many people are on it. Google's a big platform as well. And a lot of the campaigns spend an inordinate amount of money in the run up to the election, and in that get out the vote phase, for people proactively searching for candidates' names, ballot proposition information, polling information. That shifted this year because so many people are voting early. About 70% of Democrats are likely to vote before election day.
Wow.
The Democrats have had a very big and largely successful campaign. Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey and lots of other big celebrity endorsers talking about it's important to vote and vote early and get your vote sent as soon as you receive it in the mail. Republicans are more likely to vote in person on election day. Trump himself has said he doesn't necessarily like or trust mail-in voting or early voting, even though he does it himself, which is strange to me. But probably about a third of all Republicans are voting early as well, and via mail. So that traditional investment in Google will likely have shifted as well. In terms of other campaign activity, the Trump campaign say they're knocking on $1 million doors a week, and the RNC combined knock on $1 million doors. And I was in Florida in 2016, and I saw that firsthand, and I just felt like the Republicans had an advantage with field. And I do a lot of work on social media, I do a lot of work in digital, but from my active campaigning days, you can't vote on Facebook. You can't, you can inform people, you can educate people, you can remind them that there's an election going on. There is still nothing better than a candidate meeting a voter on the doorstep, or a volunteer meeting a voter on the doorstep. And that's still important. That, for me, is probably the Democrats' Achilles heel. They decided, again, probably because coronavirus and healthcare were their most important messages for this election, that Joe Biden would stay in his basement for a lot of the campaign and wouldn't travel as much. And they haven't knocked on doors. And they've made millions and billions probably of phone calls and text messages. But I still also think that that's a risk, because at the end of the day, and it's interesting, these rallies that get so much attention for Trump, right? And friends ask me, why is he doing these rallies, and why are all these people turning up without wearing masks to stand close to each other and listen to Trump? And is it going to help him? And it absolutely could, because he doesn't need those people who turn up to the rallies to vote for him. They're going to vote for him. But what he needs them to do is make phone calls for him and go and knock on doors for him. That's his army of people that are going out and knocking on those millions of doors. So if the Democrats do rely just on Facebook, just on digital channels, just on phones, they are putting themselves at a bit of a disadvantage. Now, also outside of everything else that's going on this year, how much of a disadvantage is it? I don't know, but I do think it's a risk for them. But it's a risk they've chosen to take.
Yeah. And then I suppose we spent a good chunk of time there talking about the presidential race. It's really easy to forget in the UK that there's actually a whole raft of other elections going on, including I think 35 seats in the Senate. We just don't hear about that in the UK at all. We hear nothing on the other elections taking place next week. So how's that looking? Are the Republicans going to lose control of the Senate? How's everything panning out in the other elections that are going on?
Yes, it's kind of important, right? There's there are other elections going on beyond Donald and Joe. Well, just look at the Supreme Court as an example of how important Senate elections are, right? And COVID stimulus packages in the House, of how important House races are. And then gubernatorials and House seats and Senate seats in the states, and then local councils. I mean, all the way down to local school board individuals are up for re-election. And I mean, I'll flip your question on its head, right? I'll start at the bottom. School board elections, which are 10, 20,000 voters in certain parts of the state, are wrestling with how to open schools and how to educate kids in the US, because they're not back in school in the US. for the most part, right? And every state has its own rules, but a dozen school board elected officials are making those decisions. And so right at that hyper local level, this is an important election. And it's not unreasonable for voters, when they go to their polling place or when they get their mail-in or their mailed ballot, to have 10, 15, 20 decisions to make. And there's a lot of information to be figured out on that. So, there are hugely important elections at local levels. You're right, about a third of the Senate are up for re-election. And, there's a decent chance that the Democrats flip the Senate. So, I mean, my team are involved in a couple of key races. Michigan is a really interesting race right now, insofar as, it's hugely important to the presidential campaign. It has two incumbent Democrat senators. One of them's up for re-election, who's a guy called Gary Peters. He's been there for a while. There is a pretty dynamic young black Republican running against him, and he's been polling within the margin of error. And it's a really interesting microcosm of the wider U.S. election this year, because Trump is losing in Michigan, but a great candidate as a Republican is closing the gap on an incumbent Democrat. Yes, so if that race goes the way I would like it to go, then potentially the Republicans gain an extra seat in the Senate. While that's happening, I mean, you've got key races in, I'm just reading this off the list now, so I don't have all this in my head, by the way. Maine is relatively close. North Carolina is within 1.5 points of the two candidates. There are two elections, Senate elections in Georgia, because one's a special election and one's a regular election. One of those is within the 3% margin of error. Iowa, Joni Ernst, you might have all remembered a few years ago when she was first elected. She was the lady that did a political ad where she talked about castrating bulls for a living, and that she would go to Washington, D.C. and do a similar sort of job. She is polling within the margin of error. And so her very rural Iowa is up for grabs for the Democrats this cycle. South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, who was, I believe he's the chairman of the Judiciary Committee that just got the new Supreme Court nominee confirmed. He is polling within the margin of error and potentially could lose. Arizona, where we do a lot of work, it's a really interesting race. This is another special election, and has huge implications in the Senate, because it's a lady called Martha McSally, who was appointed to the role after John McCain passed away. And she is running against a guy called Mark Kelly, who happens to be an astronaut, which is pretty much, a made-for-TV election cycle. If Mark Kelly wins, and he's polling about 6 to 8 points ahead right now, he could take his seat as quickly as November 30th. He doesn't actually have to wait until January, when the new Senate and the new Congress are sworn in. And depending on, the Supreme Court decision is already made, but depending on stimulus bills and other things, he could be another Democrat vote in the Senate. Colorado, Texas is in play, which is weird for all of us who have been in the George W. Bush era and the Karl Rove era. You'd never thought that, people would be talking about, hey, Texas could go purple, or Texas might end up having a Democrat senator. Now, do I believe it could happen? Not really, but you never know. The numbers are there. And one of the big things this year, we touched on it, is just the amount of money that's in these races, right? So the presidential race, everybody knows is going to be expensive, right? And we're talking billions of dollars expensive. Some of these Senate races are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. There's I think a Democrat was running in, maybe it was the South Carolina race. The way that the US elections do their fundraising reporting, I think it's done on a quarterly basis, then it's done on a monthly basis. The Democrat in, I believe it was South Carolina, registered $65 million in a month, raised funds. Wow. It's just insane amounts of money. And there was a guy, Terry McAuliffe, he was on a TV show recently I was watching. And he was a former Democrat governor of Virginia, and he's on Team Biden. He came out with this phrase, which is stuck with me. He's like, we have more money than we can spend. We literally don't know where to spend the money. We have so much money right now in the race. And I've had friends in Arizona say they have been receiving pieces of direct mail from the Democrat Party because they've exhausted their budgets on actually getting Democrats out to vote and trying to persuade independents. They're like, maybe we'll throw some money at the Republicans and see if we can persuade a few of them to flip their votes. So money does play a big role over here in TV advertising, digital advertising, direct mail advertising. I heard somewhere the number $14 billion has already been spent on the election, and we're not even done yet. I mean, it just beggars belief sometimes how much money is spent over here. But the question is, does it have an impact? Because Hillary outspent Donald significantly in 2016. One of the things you have to recognize about Donald Trump is he is a reality TV show expert. He knows how to get ratings. He gets a lot of free publicity. CNN and MSNBC, as much as they dislike him, can't not cover him when he goes to a rally. And so for all the money that the Biden campaign has, Trump has his reality TV persona, and that has an impact.
Andy, as always, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. What an insight into all that's going on in the States. I suppose
it's boring, right?
Yeah. My final question for you is, to use your analogy, is Leicester going to do it again? Is Trump going to win next week, or are we going to have a return to stability? Are we going to have a Biden victory? What are we going to wake up to?
Well, I can see that little red dot up in the corner saying we're still recording here, right? So I could try and fudge this and not give you an answer, but I personally believe, having kind of been in the election cycles the last few times, that Leicester can win the Premier League in 2015, and then everybody kind of realizes how to play against them, and it's harder for them the second time around. I think that analogy is also true for Trump. I think the playbook of 2016 doesn't necessarily work twice. That being said, this is not a traditional year with COVID, but because of that, I also don't think that helps Donald Trump and the campaign. I think, since the second debate, when you look at all the polls are closing, and they're all tightening since the second debate. But Biden still has a 7-point lead nationally, and he still has a lead in almost every swing state, with a couple of pretty important exceptions. I think the first debate, and given that so many people were voting early and literally had their ballots on their dining room tables when the first debate happened, and the first debate was just shockingly bad for Donald Trump and his polling and the interpretation. I think, given that almost every single Democrat is coming out this cycle, because a lot of them didn't for Hillary Clinton, and they learned from that. And I think a lot of independents are breaking towards the Democrats because they've had 4 years of Donald Trump on Twitter. I think that it's going to be incredibly difficult for him to win on the election. I almost said on election day, because he actually could win on election day, right? With more Republicans voting on election day and using electronic voting machines, he may end up having more votes tallied on election day. But this mountain of early ballots and mailed-in ballots is gonna be the key. And the key to all of that is, how quickly are they going to get counted? Because in different states, there's different rules. So here in Pennsylvania, there's a couple of good articles about this. State law is supreme on these things, right? So state law in Pennsylvania says that you cannot start counting early ballots until election morning. Whereas in Arizona, as soon as it arrives at the recorder's office, it gets counted. So in Arizona, you've got a pretty good idea of who's going to win. In Pennsylvania, we've got millions of ballots sitting in warehouses waiting to be counted, and it's unlikely they're going to be counted until Thursday, Friday. So the big issue for me is probably less about, will Donald Trump win on election day and potentially try and claim victory on election day, versus will Joe Biden concede on election day? The answer is no, he won't. And just how many legal challenges will we have? How long will those legal challenges take? I mean, again, I wasn't involved in politics back in 2000. I think that will look like, a walk in the park compared to what the days and potentially the weeks might look like after election day on Tuesday here. But I don't want to end on a negative. Like, it's going to be messy. It's going to be, U.S. elections, as they always are. But they will be successful. They will come through. The American people will have voted. They will look for, if they have to wait an extra week or two to get the vote, I believe they will be content doing that. There will be some challenges. I know that, you know, people will be worried about, you know, law and order, and I know that, you know, people in the UK ask me that, and the media, you know, will cover that. By far and large, most people are sitting at home anyway because of COVID, and you know, most people have voted, and most people are content that the system is strong enough to count the votes, determine who the winner is, and have a peaceful handover of power. And that's what America has always been about. So I'm still optimistic for that.
Well, we'll all be glued to it. Andy, thank you so much. Fascinating conversation. You know, on behalf of, you know, Don Porter, Brian Hamill, everyone else involved with Conservative Voice, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic.
It was fun. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Alex.